the chances of an opponent winning in court are quite low. It's just not worth the inconvenience. So
welcome to Beyond the Beat, a podcast by Chain Story, the agency to elevate your status in crypto. I'm your host, Pedro, and every week I'll be talking to the people in crypto media. We'll be telling their stories, their failures, their lessons, and whatever tips or tricks they've got up their sleeves.
Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Beyond the Beat. Super excited to finally chat to Mitchell Moos, formerly of Crypto Briefing, but always of the crypto media space.
Yes.
Mitchell, thanks heaps for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we dive right into it? And why don't you tell me what you think of the state of crypto media at the moment? There's no like testing the waters. This is just
by what in what regard? Like, there's a lot of things that state could mean.
I mean, that's a good question. Let's say from because you were CEO of Crypto Briefing, so you've seen it from the helm of the crypto, of a crypto media outlet. So why don't we start there? How do you think crypto media outlets are doing when it comes to just general reporting on the state of affairs?
So I think I'll start with a broad overview of how I think about the structure of the crypto media landscape. And one of the important things to understand about, especially news reporting, is that I feel like it's closer to mining than it is offering a product, and that it's kind of a commoditized product. And I don't think that most people have a strong preference for one outlet or another. And that poses all sorts of complications when you're running a crypto media outlet, because I think there's very little brand loyalty when it comes to where people want to consume their content from. So the people who are the first movers to publish content tend to be the ones that get the majority of the share, both because of, as a function of how the Google search algorithms work and how that information is propagated on social media. So it kind of creates this race to the bottom where people are trying to get something out to press as quickly as possible. And that can lead to errors and a lot more incentive to use things like generative AI or cribbing other people's stories and being just generally lazy about reporting.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on later on about the place of AI in the newsroom, because I know that when you left Crypto Briefing, you said that AI is going to fundamentally alter the state of media or companies operating in the media space.
Yeah, I spent my last year at Crypto Briefing building out new models for automating many parts of the reporting process, especially for breaking news. And I think that the publications that are going to be the first adopters of this technology are the ones that are going to get maybe a 3 or 4 year advantage in that space. Because again, since news reporting and just generally running a publication is a very cost-driven business, it's much more like a commodities business. Those who can lower their labor costs by as much as possible and minimize the production of that content in terms of the costs are the ones that are going to be the most successful.
Interesting. I know that we took a dive head first there, but let's come up for I suppose for a second. Do you want to give a sort of TLDR or just a TL on how you ended up becoming the CEO of Crypto Briefing? I was looking through your resume, and you once upon a time you were a firefighter, if I'm not mistaken, and then how did that lead you into becoming a journalist, CEO of a media outlet, and now MBA student?
I don't think the firefighting was a big determinant of whether I became a journalist or not. That was more just something that was really fun to do, since I wasn't interested in really I was studying accounting at the time, interested in doing a conventional internship. So I was like, my body is still in peak form, so may as well get some use out of it.
Interesting. How long did that last for? How long were you a firefighter
just
for?
Two summers. It's a pretty seasonal work. So here in the US, there's a ton of public forest land, and they have maybe 4 or 5 months of intense fire season where you're trying to protect homes and oftentimes hectares of timberland. So the main role of firefighting really is to protect the interests for timber and like private property.
That's interesting. I wasn't expecting that, but it low key makes sense.
Well, it's worth a lot of
Um,
money.
yeah, no, definitely. But you always expected like firefighting to be this sort of public service and not necessarily like a private service.
It is a public
Um,
service in the sense that these timber companies are not engaging directly to hire firefighters because there's a public interest in maintaining like these public spaces. A lot of it's also public land that the Bureau of Land Management then sells rights to extract the timber from to various companies. So the government has an interest in maintaining it so that it can continue getting that revenue stream from selling the land rights to various places.
Interesting. Fun fact, in Chile, firefighters are unpaid, 100% voluntary.
Interesting. My crew was
Yeah.
sent out there and we were very much paid.
Well,
It
there you
was like this
go.
was some time ago though when there's like those huge fires.
Right, right, right. And then firefighter to accountant. I suppose you became a CPA.
I did not.
Okay.
I
So
dropped
did
out to work in the UK at a company that was doing stuff with Hyperledger and IPFS, building like proof of concepts in 2018. And it was mostly for like small fintech applications and businesses that were going into that space. And that was kind of a mess because now that company's being sued by the Canadian equivalent of the SEC. So for for
ouch.
for legal securities offerings.
Okay. Well, good thing that you got out of there.
I jumped ship from
uh,
there, and that's actually what led me to journalism. Is that I didn't really know what I was going to do next, and I had been writing for Crypto Slate on the side for some time. And when I got back to the States, they offered me a full time role as one of their first hires, and they wanted me to build out their news team.
what sort of stuff were you reporting on when you first became a journalist?
So my first startup was in crypto mining. So I did a lot of stuff related to reporting on the mining space. So back in 2017, before I started working in the UK, I raised about 100K to develop like profit switching algorithms for GPU based cryptocurrency mining. So this was like stuff that would be rolled out to enterprise farms back when the mining market was much more fragmented. So this was when you could still, with the same setup, mine Ethereum and Zcash and Zen and a bunch of other stuff that doesn't exist anymore. So there's a lot more opportunity for optimizing how that hash rate is distributed across different chains.
Interesting. Do you still follow, like, do you still keep a pulse on the mining sector, or was that something just early days?
I think more than most people, just because I find it interesting. But mining again is one of those industries that's like news in that it's very commodity and cost driven. So long term, it's very hard to maintain a competitive advantage in that space. So the people that now do really well in mining are those with the lowest costs, and the lowest costs are people that can get really cheap power or very cheap hardware. So you either need a very strong relationships and connections in Bitmain, or you need to have some crazy deal with like the state of Texas to get power at like a cent per kilowatt hour.
Do you think that Bitmain represents some sort of like, because I'm super into mining, I find it a
Mm-hmm.
fascinating sector and fascinating industry. Do you think that and this is something I think about sometimes, that Bitmain is a sort of single point of failure, or that it's just accumulated so much power that it can be some sort of threat to the overall like mining industry or just general mining, like, yeah, sector?
I mean, I do think it's problematic that there's only really one main seller of commercially viable hardware. So the issue with that is for Bitmain to sell their hardware, they have to make this calculation where would they earn more money just deploying those systems themselves, or would they earn more money selling it to third parties? And because these miners are essentially money printing machines, the price that they can charge is directly proportional to how much they expect firms to earn as revenue from these machines. So that really that market power leads to some results that could be unsavory for the industry in terms of just
Interesting.
having too much centralization in a single entity that has control over the ability to participate actively in the Bitcoin mining space.
Yeah, no, I feel like it's this sort of black box that people don't want to talk about enough, and I feel like it's definitely a problem.
But do I
Um,
actually think it's a risk to the network? I don't necessarily think so, because just because something is centralized doesn't necessarily mean that there is an economic incentive to change anything. Because even for these miners, if you have a majority of the network, your goal would be to be perceived as having less than a majority of the network and trying to maximize how much revenue that you're generating from these machines. So I think it would be very similar to someone who has a huge stake in like a proof of stake related coin. You don't want you don't want to rock the boat too much, because the value of your coins or the value of your machines are tied to public perceptions on how secure the network is. And even if there's a short-term incentive to like attack a network, that doesn't actually mean that that aligns with the longer-term economic incentives of wanting to maximize the present value of those coins or machines that you have.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that and I make this mistake sometimes that's like equating a problem with a necessarily becoming an attack vector or like a real threat to either the network or the industry or the sector or anything like that. Um, but yeah, going back to your days at Crypto Slate. So
Mhm.
you built out the newsroom. You're covering crypto mining and then you're building out the newsroom. What
Yes.
specifics were you like were you focusing on back then to build out? Like when let's say we want to build out a newsroom again from scratch. What did you do back then that you think was successful, and what did you do back then that you think was unsuccessful?
Hmm. I think the big thing that traffic is king always. And I feel that what made my role and just generally Crypto Slate successful is that there is a big quantitative component to producing news that's not necessarily talked about that often or very sexy. But I was doing a lot of meta analysis using like R and Google Analytics to determine like general trends in terms of which stories and what formats and lengths and things like that, what attributes are associated with um, productive content. So at the end of the day, that you could produce content more efficiently at a lower cost and with less work. Because I think the mistake that people make, and that I made really early on in my career, is I would write a huge investigative story that's like 2,000, 3,000 words and be like, oh man, this is going to generate so much traffic. Like, this is a really cool story. And then nobody cares. When I could have done the same thing in like 500 words and gotten the same impact. And I feel that the part of me that wants to be a journalist that reports really in depth on stories that I find interesting is much different than what the economic reality of what the demand is in terms of certain reporting or certain coverage of the industry.
Do you think that there is like an economically viable like scheme, I suppose I'm going to call it, or like strategy for these in-depth investigations that need to happen or that journalists find interesting and that they do resonate with like a small percentage of the market, but is it economically viable? Is there like a business model there?
There is, only if you're not willing to make that content public. So if you're willing to work as like more like a research shop and provide this information to like a small group of people that are making investments on that information, whether that's being from the like the research side or from like the trading hedge fund side, then it's possible. Because the issue with investigative reporting is that there's a much smaller group of people that have a high interest in this information. So unless you're able to extract a much larger sum of money from those people, then that's the only way it can be viable. Otherwise, if you're providing that information for free to a large audience, which I think is the most like publicly beneficial thing to do, there's not really a way to monetize that content. And there's issues with intellectual property where other sites are just going to pull your primary sources and just cover the same story that you spent a lot of time producing.
Did that ever happen to you? Did you ever write one of those like long pieces and you think to yourself, this is going to hit hard, and then just to see it sort of scrambled together by other companies or other outlets and like passed off, not necessarily as their own, but just like, yeah, recycled?
Absolutely. I mean, that's just a fact of the media space in general. This doesn't just happen with written content too. It happens between like conventional news outlets and like TV stations, for example, where they'll cite a story that someone else has done all the legwork in producing and basically monetize that portion of it by putting it into a different format. So it can happen in many different ways. And I think it's just a fundamental issue with how public reporting works.
But do you remember any specific story that happened to you that you just thought to yourself like, "Fuck, I can't believe that."
A specific story? I mean, there was a huge investigation that I did on Dragon Chain that took me like 3 years to put together. And it was more out of
Three
the
years.
3 years. Yeah. There's a lot like it really hit close to home. There's a lot of drama involved in this story because the CEO from that company was also someone that I knew personally from the Seattle area, which is where I was based previously when I was working at CryptoSlate. And they made it very personal by, I think, calling me an anti-Semite, the CEO of this company, and just a racist online. And I was like, all right, like what is going on here? And then a bunch of employees from this company reached out to me privately and just like, this is a complete mess. They have a Wells notice from the SEC. There's a lot of problems. The CEO's off his rocker. Like, so there was, I think, a pretty strong public interest for me to write a story about this. And I spent years putting together this story because there's another problem with news reporting is if you're writing a piece of content that's adversarial, usually the legal risk, even if the chances of an opponent winning in court are quite low, it's just not worth the inconvenience. So the inconvenience of being sued is oftentimes a reason why a publication is not going to publish something.
Did that ever happen to you while you were at CryptoSlate? Like any legal recourse, maybe not necessarily against you, Mitchell, but against any of the reporters that were under your supervision?
For me and for the reporters, where there'd just be a story that's too hot, where it's just like, do we publish the story and get the 5,000 views or whatever, or do we just shelve it and work on stuff that's lower hanging fruit? And that happens all the time. And I feel like that probably happens at every news outlet, unless you're so big like a CoinDesk where you have a whole department that's set up to deal with those kinds of complaints. So I think for smaller publications, especially, the risk of legal inconvenience is definitely a reason not to report on stories.
Right, right. Do you so how was because then after CryptoSlate, you were editor in chief for what, like a year or a bit over a year, or even longer?
At Crypto Briefing
Um,
or at CryptoSlate?
CryptoSlate.
I was there for about a year, and then the company was planning to move to London, and it just didn't make sense with where I was at in my career at that point to also move again because I had just come back from the UK and was in India for another job as part of that first startup. And I was trying to have perhaps a little bit more stability in my life. And I didn't want to just rock the boat again by moving so soon after coming back to the United States.
That makes sense. And that's when you moved over to Crypto Briefing.
Yeah, so Crypto Briefing, I honestly wanted to exit the media space because I saw a lot of these problems early on where I felt like long-term media is a break-even kind of game. And it's very difficult for you to establish yourself as a publication that has longevity. And we've seen this time and time again where publications either just fail outright or they just burn money. And you need some sort of other business to support it, whether that's Consensus, whether that's a company uh, like Bullish or DCG. There needs to be some profit-making center that's supporting the news business because the news business is either going to be break even or losing money. So, in terms of long-term career prospects, I think working in media can be tricky. And the only reason that I went to Crypto Briefing is they needed someone on very short notice, and I had a good relationship with John Rice professionally, and he put my name in the hat as his first choice to be his replacement. And there was a lot of courting that went on that was just like, all right, I'll do it for 3 months and then I'll help you find someone else and I'm out of here. But it just kept getting dragged out and eventually I stuck around.
Yeah, because you stuck around for 4 years.
Almost 5 years, yeah.
Almost 5 years. Yeah. what are yeah, I'm intrigued by how that because that's a long dragging on.
I know. Yeah. At a certain point, I just became so. I was just like, man, there's got to be a way to make this work, to make a media outlet profitable and have that longevity. And I felt really committed to trying to build out a business model that I thought was sustainable. And eventually, my conclusion at the end of those 5 years is that it's very hard to build that business model. And even if you do, the rewards for doing so are pretty low, in the sense that if you had spent that time doing basically anything else in the crypto space, you probably would be better off.
Yeah, that's interesting because I feel like everybody recognizes like the need for media, the need for journalism, the everything that it entails, but then people often
But nobody
overlook
wants to
that
pay for it.
yeah, people overlook that you need to finance it somehow. And so we live in this sort of fairy tale where it's like, oh, journalists need to exist and it's amazing that you're a journalist and that like covering this stuff and everybody recognizes that we need more investigations and like on-chain analysis. And then you're like, yeah, but the economics isn't actually there. And like the media is always sort of teetering on the border, like on the limit of collapsing or just like completely shifting. And
Yep.
people are just so short-sighted in that sense, I feel.
And there's no shortage of people that want to really like start their own media outlets and lose money. So there's always pressure to get in this space where everyone's just trying to compete for this very small pie. And the grand prize for being the winner of this fight is not that big either. So I
Very
honestly
optimistic
liken
conversation, this one.
indeed I liken journalists to being like social workers. They do it out of the kindness of their heart and because they're bitter about the space.
Yeah, the bitterness is definitely something I can relate to. The what
I
do you
couldn't
think
envision
about
myself doing anything else because I'm just like, if I worked like shilling NFTs or like working on meme coins or something, I would I would make more money, but at the same time at the expense of other people. And at least for me, there's not a scenario where I would feel comfortable working in the space where I felt like it wasn't actually some sort of benefit to people. So it just
it's
made it tough to
also
find any other job.
it's also interesting because it becomes like this self-reinforcing loop because you're like you might be skeptical about it and the more that you research and you write about it you become even more skeptical about it and then you just start to think
Yes.
of yourself because like I can't work in any other way in this industry because I like understand how it works and there's something like deeply that I clash with and so yeah, it becomes this weird and then it becomes so weird to think about all the journalists that become PR people for the industry. And so
Yes.
that's always been such a weird turn of profession that I've never like come entirely to grasp with.
Well,
Um,
at a certain point, you just get tired of being poor.
that's true. That's true. Poverty is definitely an incentive enough to move on to other things.
I do think that's the case where there's a lot of sunk costs associated with lawyer. Once you've been in the journalism space for long enough, you have to find a way to cope and rationalize it to be like, all right, there is a reason why I'm doing this. And I think that people retroactively apply that to their career where I don't want to switch because it has this, there's this public benefit. There's public externalities associated with me working in the journalism space. So even though that I'm poor, at least I have my integrity. But at a certain point, people are just like, all right, now I have kids, I'm settling down. It would be nice not to be poor.
That would be nice. That would be nice. It's something to I suppose to strive for in the long run. Um, what do you think of like so like this race between publications on the idea of like speed and accuracy and like the ever or the never ending churn of like the news cycle because this is something that I think about a lot as well and I think this is like an obvious segue to when it comes to like what we're talking about this idea like journalists are always having to grapple also with all right we got to push out the news cycle as much as possible keep it running but it is a sort of race to the bottom because how much news is actually news and then how much news actually matters and then you've got to deal with like companies that are sort of pushing things into the cycle as well that isn't exactly news but you've got to keep it all running, you know? How do you think
Yeah.
about that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of perverse incentives that encourage outlets to publish content that probably shouldn't be its own story, where you might have like six stories on the same thing, where it's like a new development happened and you do an addendum to to that by publishing another story, and you just keep doing that over and over again. And then there's this incentive to publish as quickly as possible. So you might have like the CoinDesk, the notorious CoinDesk like 2 bullet point article that's just there just so that you can get indexed on Google. And I'm just like, man, this is so sad. This is what our profession is boiled down to: is who can write the fastest tweet, but then put it into an article wrapper so that it can get indexed by Google.
Yeah, no,
So
that's. What do you think? Like, how do you think that social media plays a role in all this? Like, because I feel like I love to write, and I do love to write like longer form articles, not just your like classic 400, 500 like bites or yeah, posts or anything like that. But how do you think that social media is also changing like the news and media landscape from either independent journalists, but also this idea that people are just interested in that like tweet that gives them the headline, a couple bullet points, and then on to the next and on to the next, and nothing like properly registers.
And it's a feedback loop because a lot of stories are sourced from social media, and one of the main distribution channels to be successful in the news space is also to be leveraging social media to generate traffic. So you have these stories that are written from other people discovering something on Twitter that's already blowing up. So you're just like, all right, I need to be able to extract some portion of that traffic by writing a story on it in that 400, 500 word format that we're talking about. And then the reverse happens where people are tweeting about stories that are published, and oftentimes they're not even like referencing the original source that they're getting that information from. So if CoinDesk breaks a story, someone's going to tweet about it. They may not necessarily cite it, or even if they do cite it, CoinDesk is not going to see very much of that traffic. So you just continually get this feedback loop of people trying to jockey for Twitter clout, because Twitter
Mm.
clout is that an ultimate currency that you can use to convert into a successful PR or VC career.
So it's all about Twitter then.
In the US, it's about Twitter, yeah.
What do you where do you stand on the whole sort of speed versus accuracy or speed versus analysis game? Like, because you've got everybody's trying to be first, but then first gives you that like initial bump of dopamine that you jump on Google and it's like, oh, I'm first. But then like the article is either like you say 2 bullet points just so that you're indexed and there's no real analysis, there's nothing really there. How do you look at it? Like, are you a fan, or do you believe in like the idea that speed matters most?
For breaking news, yes. I mean, it's unquestionable that speed matters most, and especially if you're writing content for a public audience, there's very few ways to differentiate yourself because, again, news is mostly a commodity business. If people see two stories, there's not going to be much preference for whether they choose CoinDesk over Cointelegraph over the block. It's really about who gets the publication first and who's going to be the number one result on Google. So, in that respect, I think that speed is very important. The second point I'll make is that if you're trying to do longer form analysis, then it makes sense to have some sort of like a subscription model or a research model, or to have like a VC fund associated with it, or to have basically any other kind of business that's not advertising to support the media business. So the only way that I've seen news outlets work long term are you either get super huge and you can't really be dislodged because your moat is so big. You're like a coin telegraph where the Google algorithm just loves you because you've been around for so long. You have so much content. It doesn't matter if whatever you publish is complete garbage, which I don't think Cointelegraph is complete garbage. To be clear, like I think they've really gotten their game
Disclaimer.
together.
I'll put out a massive disclaimer.
Disclaimer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one way to go about monetization. The other way is through events, like we've seen with Consensus, CoinDesk Consensus, or the Blockworks uh, conferences that they hold in like New York and London. Or there's also podcasts, which is also how Blockworks initially got their business started, was helping do the operations and distributions for big podcasters. And then finally, you have like a subscription model where you might be like a Delphi, but I think the subscription model probably works best if you also have a VC fund attached to it, but that also has its own conflicts of interest associated with it, where now you're writing about content while simultaneously potentially having a vested interest in supporting particular projects because you're also invested in them. So I also think that's kind of weird. So there's all these issues. And then finally, I don't think that it's necessarily a binary trade off where it's either speed or depth. I think that a common process that I deployed and that a lot of other news outlets deploy is that they're going to try to publish something as quickly as possible that's minimally viable. And then they're going to flesh out that story over the course of 20 minutes so that they actually have something like respectable, or maybe even an hour or two. So you get the 2 bullet points out in like 5 minutes, and then over the course of the next 45 minutes or an hour, you actually write the rest of the story on the fly.
AI aside, we'll touch on AI in a bit, but like, what are the biggest changes that you're seeing to like the media industry or just the journalism industry or sector as a whole?
I think just like newspapers, print is probably on its way out, or at least the volume of print content that people consume is decreasing, because I think the habits of consumers have changed significantly. So now you're seeing a lot more video content or social media driven content being the main drivers of traffic for these news websites. And I think people are moving away from having this model where most of the content's consumed through an independent website like a coindesk.com or a defiant.io, and more along the lines of being consumed through Telegram channels, Discord chats, Twitter, or YouTube, or even like TikTok reels. So consumer preference is definitely changing the game significantly in terms of how these outlets need to adapt in the type of content that they're producing and the channels that they're using. And I also think that that change is probably for the worse again, because not having your own website means that it's much more difficult to monetize that content, and you're at the mercy of these platforms, whether that's Twitter or TikTok or YouTube or whatever. And now changes in the terms of service on those platforms can just completely destroy your business. So even like a 10% change in the revenue distribution or a change in the algorithm of how Facebook, for example, back in, I think it was 2016, 2015, they significantly changed how pages worked and how the content from pages was served to the general public on Facebook. And that just completely destroyed the news business there, because that one algorithm change made it so that publishing content on Facebook is not really viable anymore.
And if you're I totally agree. And I've got this like little newsletter side business and I'm also pushing a lot of the idea that all of the audience that you have on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok is just like a rented audience. And at the end of the day, you are at the behest of whether terms and services change or algorithms change or deplatforming might also be a risk, or like content structures, all that sort of stuff. So
It's a
I
hazardous
totally agree.
business.
It is a hazardous business. It's an unexpectedly hazardous business. But considering that like reality, if you're a journalist that's just getting started, or a content creator that's just looking to be like, okay, I want to like make this my career, which is a bold move considering, and maybe don't listen to this conversation up until now because you might be a bit disheartened. But if you were to just tune in now, like what would you keep in mind if you were to look back and be like, all right, Mitchell is just starting out as a journalist now, like considering the stuff that you know, how you see the changes that are happening, what are the skill set that new journalists or new content creators are going to have moving forward?
I wouldn't recommend anyone become a breaking news journalist because, again, having a broad knowledge base of just random arcane facts about the crypto space and trivia is hard to transfer to areas outside of breaking news. And I think breaking news, again, is a commodity driven business. If I was to recommend someone who was getting into journalism today, I would tell them to try to be a subject matter expert in one very specific thing, whether that's dissecting SEC filings or like doing on-chain analysis or something that other people are not going to be able to do as well as you because you put in the hours and the time. And that's really your entire brand is around doing this one particular thing. Then I think you can build a sustained following. And the second thing that I'll caveat here is that I don't think that becoming a journalist is a bad career move if you're early on in your career and you're looking to do it for a few years, because I think it gives you a lot of opportunities to move into other spaces where you need to build your credibility and your expertise somehow. And I think that journalism is one way to scale that pretty quickly in a short amount of time, because otherwise you're just not going to get the reps in that you need to become a subject matter expert.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. Like the idea, and I think that people are always scared to niche down, and they're like, "Oh, if I niche down, it's gonna like pigeonhole me in a specific area." But I do think that people overlook like the informational advantage that you get from being like the or one of the experts in say like mining or ordinals or yeah, any specific area of the industry. Um,
And it gives you more opportunities to branch out later. It's not something that needs to be you're only doing ordinals for your entire career, because then when there's another, I don't know, development on Bitcoin that extends its usability to other stuff, then you're going to be the go-to person to analyze that in the context of your experience covering ordinals.
how important do you think it is to like master writing?
I think it really depends on what niche that you're in. So I'll give a spectrum here. If you're writing about technical stuff like going into new projects' GitHub repos and like analyzing the quality of their code and trying to search for vulnerabilities, people don't really care about grammar or style or anything like that. It's a lot more it's a lot more functional in its form. But if you're one of those people, and I think that this is an interesting positioning move, like if you've read Wired, for example, the storytelling aspect of that kind of content is on the other extreme the the spectrum of writing skill. And I think it actually takes a lot of skill to write a compelling narrative about a project or like the trajectory of someone controversial like Roger Ver or Greg Wright, where
I
there's
was
a lot
just
more
thinking of
nuance and
Roger Ver.
story.
Yeah.
Yeah, where it's not necessarily black and white, and telling that story in a way that's interesting does require a lot of expertise in the actual craft of writing. So I think it really depends on where you want to position yourself and where your strengths are as a professional. So if you have a technical background and you excel at doing data analysis and on-chain analysis, or you have a strong background in Solidity, then the writing stuff probably doesn't matter nearly as much. But if you're someone that is an exceptional writer, then trying to tell those stories that no one else is going to be able to write in the same way as you, because you have the contacts and you have the writing skills to actually flesh it out, then that's the other side of the spectrum that you can specialize in, is doing breaker mag style, like long form stories that are just intriguing glimpses into the culture of the crypto space.
What would you say is Mitchell's like unique skill set then when it comes to thinking about this kind of stuff? Like, so you've got like super technical people, you've got those beaters, or you've got, yeah, where would you say you're like, aside from trying to understand the nuances of the economics of the crypto media space? But yeah.
I think being a ruthless cost cutter and pragmatic. I think it takes a certain kind of person to run a media outlet, because you essentially on a day-to-day basis need to look at both the idealistic part of journalism, which is the ethics and the public externalities generated from producing this kind of content, and weigh that against the realities that are faced by the business. So you'd oftentimes have to be thinking about, is it worth making a trade-off between quality and speed, or a trade-off between accuracy and being able to get content out at scale so that your business is actually sustainable? So those are really hard to swallow. And if you're someone that's a diehard journalist, I think it's going to be very difficult for you to face those realities. And you kind of are going to get beat down if you're not pragmatic about it. And I've seen this happen where if you're someone who was a journalist and now that you run a media outlet, I think you can become pessimistic very quickly, in the sense of just like, man, I didn't have to think about all this stuff because someone up there at the organization was dealing with the advertising nonsense and the relationships and making these kinds of calls for like what content to write. One, your job as an individual contributor as a journalist, and you just have to think about writing really good content writing quickly, working on your craft, I think that's a much more pure way to look at to like engage with your profession. And transitioning to being a manager of a news outlet requires a completely different set of skills that can be pretty difficult to pick up if you don't have that mindset from the get-go.
Yeah, that I think that's a good segue into like the impending AI question that I think a lot of people think
I
about
mean, it's
as
not even
well.
impending, it's already here.
Yeah, I meant impending in the way of like the topic that that I wanted to touch on. But yeah, it's definitely already here. And I know that you reckon that like companies that master the AI like technology, let's call it, are going to master like the news cycle. Um how do you see it? Like where do you see AI plugging into, or I guess the question, I guess that's the question. Like that's a broad question and a vague question because I feel like AI is going to plug into everything from whether
Yeah.
that's like research side of things, whether that's the writing process, whether that's just the general publishing like sector. But where do you think are like the biggest threats to or the biggest problems? And then where's the biggest opportunities for whether that's journalists, editors, media in general, when it comes to like AI.
Well, I think first and foremost that AI is just going to completely disrupt the whole genre of just written and print content because it's like generative AI models are built basically to do this thing. And especially when it comes to things like breaking news, it's going to completely change how breaking news journalists do their jobs because they're going to go from people that previously had to do everything manually to being the ones who are simply just checking the output of a model and making sure that's accurate and trying to direct that energy to making sure that there's high amounts of signal in that the content that they're producing and that they're leveraging those tools efficiently for how it interacts with the rest of the publication. So it's it's going to be tricky. I think that there's going to be a lot of resistance from publications to adopt this technology because journalists are a bit old school in the technologies that they want to use. Even crypto journalists are very reluctant to adapt to new things because they're already so squeezed for time. Like they need to spend all their time ingesting a ridiculous amount of content on social media. They need to spend a bunch of their time like being on call essentially to write stories on short notice. The idea that they have to spend a good chunk of their day now to like retool their skills and like learn a completely new skill set is pretty daunting to someone that's been a journalist for a long time. So I think that's one of the big risks is that you're going to have this whole old guard of journalists who are going to be very resistant to the technology, and they're likely going to feel a certain way about this new crop of like younger journalists who aren't even doing very much writing at all. They may not even be very good writers for a matter of fact, but they just have the skills necessary to utilize AI to do reporting much more quickly with higher accuracy and leverage these tools to change how and the volume of content that they're able to produce. And I think the other risks associated with AI is that it makes it a lot easier basically to repackage stories from other publications, which is already an existing problem in pre-AI journalism. You see this happen all the time where the stories that outlets write are all very similar to each other because they're basically the same stories. They're all being the inspiration is being taken from the same sources on social media, or they're literally just looking at stories on other publications and rewriting them so they can get a sliver of that traffic that the first to publish has already gotten. And the reason for that is because being first to publish takes a lot more work, especially if it's a longer piece. So even if you only get a smaller percentage of that traffic, there's still an incentive to do it because it's low hanging fruit.
Right, right. It's interesting the idea of like journalists becoming AI editors or AI vetters and just
Yeah.
like that's eventually going to be the role that writers or journalists play, which is just grabbing yeah, whatever the output is, figuring it out, maybe adding a source or maybe adding like a specific quote to it. And then that's going to be the story at the end of the day. And I agree. I think that the people who are going to be slow to just accept reality, because I think that it's just reality, you know, like AI is here, companies are using it, like writers are using it, either you accept it and you just become pragmatic and you use it in your favor, or you're just going to be left behind, and then you're just going to suffer the consequences of that.
I do think it presents a lot of opportunities as well. Like, I think that opportunities and potential threats. The opportunity side is that the accuracy and the ability for these models to be more unbiased is probably higher than humans, because we as individuals, we probably have certain proclivities towards, we might feel a certain way about Cardano or Ripple because of our past history dealing with them, but the reality of where they're at today may be a lot different than what it was in 2017 or 2018, given their long history. And I feel that having an effectively tuned model can probably write a story in a way that is even more pragmatic than the most pragmatic of journalists.
Especially when it comes to Ripple and Cardano, who need the most pragmatic and unbiased of journalists. Man, we're heading up on time. I think that the AI story, or the AI just appearance, is fascinating in and of itself, and it's interesting. And I chat to a lot of journalist friends who are super reluctant to use it. And I don't use it much for writing. I use it for researching and specific stuff. But I understand that either I start to learn slowly but surely how to use it in my favor, or I'm going to get left behind. That's just the inevitable fate of how it's all moving. But
it's going to change video content as well. It's not just written content. So I don't think people understand how powerful these tools are. So I think it's super important that if you're coming into this space right now, that you become very comfortable using these models, and just beyond just interacting with ChatGPT, for example, finding ways to build micro models that are built off of, say, the past. The whole, you can, for example, take all the content that's been written on CoinDesk, run that through a model, and now every single piece of content that you run through this new model is written exactly in CoinDesk style. Ways to actually optimize the process where it's not just you using the existing out of the box tools, but refining and honing those tools specifically for the applications of your work is also going to be quite important.
Yeah, no, and I think that you're right. The way it's gonna change things in the video and audio side of things. You already see it now, AI generated celebrities and voiceovers and things like that are just going to completely alter how not only people create content, but how people also consume content.
I'm optimistic about it, though. I think that the fundamental role of a journalist still hasn't changed. At the end of the day, what a journalist does is that there's all this noise that's happening out there. There's all these stories, there's all this information that one must sift through. And the role of a media outlet isn't necessarily to be just reporting on what's going on, but it's serving to people and highlighting what is actually important in the space right now. If you have 5 minutes a day to spend trying to keep abreast of everything that's happening in the crypto space, which moves so quickly, then the role of a journalist is quite important, because you're the one that's actually serving as the curator of the information that's important. And I think that's really the primary role of a lot of these media outlets, is to curate the content that is the most important to keeping up to date with the space for your particular audience. So that part still hasn't changed. I think it's just more along the lines of just taking a broader outlook to the profession, understanding that's the value that a journalist delivers.
It's a more heartening note than what we've been speaking about during the rest of this conversation. I always end these conversations on the same two questions, which goes along the lines of reading. I'm always intrigued by what other people in the journalist space or the media space are reading. And so first question is, what book are you currently reading? And then what book do you usually recommend, or have you been recommending lately? This doesn't have to necessarily be crypto specific. You can go in any direction you want. But yeah, those are the two last questions.
Yeah, so right now I'm reading a book on money laundering. It's Moneyland, the inside story of the crooks and kleptocrats who rule the world. And I think that the intersection between like the financial systems and the gaps in the financial systems, and understanding how illicit money gets moved through the economy is quite interesting and very relevant to crypto. So, good book that I'd recommend that I'm reading right now. And then I think in general, does the book have to be journalism slash crypto specific, or just books that I like?
Just books that you like. Yeah, anything goes.
Oh man, one of my favorite books of all time is The Power Broker by about Robert Moses by Robert Caro. It's a like a prolific biography about the person that had a huge impact on New York and infrastructure in the United States. It's just beautifully written. And it won the Pulitzer Prize because I can understand why. It's this very dense and like hard to wrangle topic about a very nuanced person that is written in a narrative style as almost as if it was fiction. And I think that the most gifted writers are the people who can take nonfiction topics and write them as if in a compelling narrative that reads like it's a fiction story.
Yeah, no, great recommendation. And I totally agree. I'm a massive fan of biographies, and I'm a massive fan of biographies that are read in that sort of storytelling vibe, and that
Yeah.
not just like hard hitting facts, but just like take you on the journey of the person and what they went through and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah, appreciate that recommendation. Nice one. But yeah, Mitchell, this has been great. I really appreciate the time and the ideas and the laughter. So, yeah. I'm excited to
Well,
see what's next.
I hope I didn't kill your confidence in the profession.
I mean, you didn't kill my confidence. Maybe you killed the confidence of somebody who's listening in or who's going to watch this later on and who's thinking about just taking the dive. Maybe, but know for a fact that there are people who are doing good stuff, and that it's a fun career and it's really interesting, and not everything is as like wallowed in pity as what we just talked about. But
You'll
yeah,
never be bored.
that's for sure. That's for sure. But yeah, man, this was a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks a lot for
Thanks
coming
for
on.
having me on.
Catch up.